This is Iowa non-farm employment, the map of it. The red arrow is indicating the 4 recessions preceding, the 2 that created the issue with the farm prices. Before that, you can see that non-farm employment in Iowa tended to grow consistently up through about January of 1980, a little bit after that, when it peaked and started down. And Iowa employment declined for 3 years after that. Iowa population declined. Iowa workforce declined. About everything declined. And the green arrow is the end of the 1983 session, where it kind of made a difference in how Iowa handled things, and probably lots of other states too. But Iowa's history, according to my research anyway, for tax credits, basically goes back to 1983 in that session. If you look at the 1983 code, so the code that was in place in the 1983 legislature took out, there was no economic development heading in the index of the Iowa code. There were 20 sales tax exemptions in the code. There are now 103. The only tax credits that existed was a child independent care credit that was assisted people that had essentially special needs children and dependents. There was a personal credit that we still have. There's personal credit for taxpayers or dependents. There was extra ones for 65 and over in line. We still have that. At that time, it was $15. And then there was an adoption expense deduction. We now have an adoption expense tax credit. But that was it. We really couldn't find a business or a special purpose tax credit in the Iowa code at that time. The 1983 legislation enacted 3 pieces of legislation, 2 of them very significant and that still exist today. There was what we call 260E now, job training, which is a withholding funded by employee withholding, money that never comes to the general fund. It comes from the withholding of employees that are at these qualified businesses, where they use to pay for job training of those employees, and instead of remitting their withholding tax to the state for this particular instances, they use it for job training. The second, it is called 260E. It was not 260E at the time. It was 280B or something like that. But it has moved in its code. And it still exists. Senate File 548 there in the middle was a venture capital fund investment tax credit that was enacted then. 5% of the qualified investment. I always had a history over the years of attempting to induce investment in seed capital and venture capital. This is the first one I found. It lasted about 6 years. There have been numerous different attempts at venture capital, but this was the first one. And then the third one is Senate File 386, which was the IRC update bill that year, that started the state research activities credit. There was a federal research activities credit that had been around, and Iowa piggybacked on that to allow a 6.5% tax credit for research activities. That started back in 1983 also. Other legislation of the 1980s that was significant related to economic development. The Iowa Lottery was created in 1985. It was to sunset in 5 years. It created the Iowa Plan Fund, and the Iowa Plan Fund was to be used for economic development, not for tax credits, but for programs, funding programs to boost the Iowa economy. And that bill also created the framework for what became the next year Iowa Department of Economic Development. Economic Development Department was created in the Reorganization Act of 1986, and of course Economic Development has become an Economic Development Authority that happened in 2011. The next act that I would point out was in the next year, in 87, the tuition and textbook tax credit was created. One of our first, I would call it a social credit, to do a social thing as opposed to a economic development. The next item, similarly, Iowa piggybacked on the federal earned income tax credit in 1989. creating a Iowa State earned income tax credit equal to 5% of the federal credit. It's grown to, I believe, 14% now. And then at the bottom, there was a new jobs tax credit created in 1989 that kind of piggybacked on 260E. Then we come to 1994, which was our first, basically our first program of economic development, a package of tax incentives that businesses could qualify for if certain requirements were met. 1994, I believe, the first half of this, it was called the Quality Jobs, Enterprise Zones, and New Jobs and Income Act. And Quality Jobs, Enterprise Zones, I believe, was a company-specific program. The legislation required that the Department of Economic Development create within 30 days after the end of that session a enterprise zone or a enterprise zones. Could be more than one, 2,500 acres or so. And it was, seems to be clearly aimed for a specific situation. And it had a package on the top there of incentives that a company within that enterprise zone, a quality enterprise zone, could qualify for. This is where we came up with our 10% investment tax credit, a non-refundable, in most instances, non-refundable tax credit. 10%. In this case, it was 10%. It wasn't up to, it was 10%. Property tax exemption, 20 years. Sales and use tax refunds, and exemptions for qualified purchases. A research activities credit, and this is where we come up with, we went from a 6.5% standard research activity credit to a supplemental research activity credit. That could be up to double the regular credit, so I think it's 13%. And then there was exemption for certain land ownership restrictions in the Iowa Code. I skipped over the first sub-bullet underneath there. We also came up with that bill, the supplemental 260E tax credit, the withholding tax credit. Before it was 1.5% of the gross wages of the qualified employment. It went to 3, up to a maximum of 3% with the 1994 Act, so double. And then going along with that, as opposed to passing this bill for this one employment situation, the bottom half was the creation of the NJIP, or the New Jobs and Income Program, which was a program that businesses could apply for, and not just for that one area, but for all areas of the state. Apply to the Department of Economic Development and become a participant in the NJIP. And it had a similar set of incentives that the Quality Jobs Enterprise Zone had. They weren't quite as, it wasn't quite as there will be a 20-year exemption. It was an up to a 20-year exemption on property taxes. There wasn't a 10% called, you get a 10% investment tax credit, you get up to a 10% tax credit. NJIP was replaced by the High Quality Jobs Program in 2005, and then the Quality Jobs Enterprise Zone was repealed in 2014. 97 legislation brought on what is most of people remember as the Enterprise Zone Program, which was a program, the legislature realized that there are certain areas of the state that could use more help than other areas of the state. So counties and cities were allowed to designate a small portion of their area as a enterprise zone. And enterprise zones could get a little more lucrative incentives than regular, all those places that weren't inside enterprise zones. And then in '98, there was a housing component added that started the state on the path of providing incentives to create workforce housing. Enterprise zones was repealed in 2014, when it was also replaced with the High Quality Jobs Program. For briefly, there was in 2003, there was a new capital investments program. Similarly, it was a package of incentives that businesses could qualify for. Its kind of main feature to me was that it required the community to apply for it. the business would make sure, the committee would make sure that the business qualified for them, that they wanted it also, but the application actually would come from the community. It was repealed just 2 years later when the High Quality Jobs Program was created. And it was created in 2005, and it still exists today. It's more complicated than previous programs that I've discussed. There were sliding scales, the Department of Economic Development, now the Economic Development Authority has a lot of discretion about what they can negotiate, particular packages, and the level of investment, the level of employment is important in how much incentive a particular situation gets. And that is what exists today. High Quality Jobs Program is the main economic development program in the state. Other significant tax credit legislation over these years. In 2000, we started the state starts in a different kind of path where we start to incent specific activity more than business, just general business activity. Where we get historic preservation in 2000, a 25% tax credit for the restoration, rehabilitation, or repurpose of historic buildings. Program that still exists. Ethanol Blended Gasoline Act in 2001 started the state. Prior to that time, as we still do, we have a tax differential for ethanol, fuel ethanol versus fuel that doesn't have ethanol. Well, this brought on an income tax credit for retailers to provide incentive to push ethanol blended fuel, and we still have that concept too, but now with biofuels in general. And then in 2004, wind energy production credit, where the state began offering incentives for wind production of electricity. And, in 2009, in response to perhaps this was getting out of hand, that there was a lot more going out in tax credits than maybe the state should be. The limitations were put on it in the Tax Credit Limitation Act in 2009. And that put an aggregate annual tax credit award limitation on a number of the programs operated by the Department of Economic Development. And the original limitation was $180 million, I believe. It's now 170, although I think effectively it's $115 million. And you can see the list of programs that are aggregate limited with the Department of Economic Development. The biggest one is high quality jobs. Enterprise zone no longer exists. Existing device tax credit does not get used. Qualifying business tax credit is a venture capital investment type credit, along with the Innovations Fund tax credit. Those are smaller credits. The redevelopment tax credit is brownfields and grayfields. Workforce housing tax incentive program is a growing program of providing incentives to build housing to house the workforce. And then most recently added is the renewable chemical tax credit. All those programs have to fit within the 170, what I think is now $155 million tax credit cap. And so the department, the authority has to work within that cap when providing, when addressing incentives with individual companies. Tax credit reductions and oversight, when we get into this cap that passed in 2010, the recession that started in the U.S. in December of 2007 started really impacting Iowa revenue in the really late calendar year 2008. The 2010 legislature enacted Senate File 2380 to have tax credit because after a 10% across the board tax credit, the idea would be to have the tax credits also provide some of the revenue changes necessary to deal with that recession. So many of our tax credits either got tax credit caps at that bill, or their tax credit caps that existed were reduced by 10%. The historic preservation tax credit was limited to $50 million a year. It went down to 45. The ACE, or Accelerated Career Education Program, was a $6 million cap. It went down to 5.6. That kind of thing happened. And the Equine Development Authority cap was reduced to $120 million. It's since raised to 170 in 2013. That act also created the Legislative Tax Expenditure Committee that meets annually to review a rolling list of each of our tax credits that are provided in the list. In part of the history, I was asked about tax credits that have been repealed. This is the list of tax credit that have been repealed over the years. Many of them, though, were repealed and just replaced. The top half of this, livestock production, film, waves, those two small soy-based tax credits have all gone away. The tax credit trust fund tax credit was just eliminated lately. There was a disaster recovery housing project tax credit that was never used. Quality enterprise zones we talked about a minute ago. Then we get down to these replaced ones, the venture capital. We still do venture capital and seed capital tax credits. We don't do that one anymore. Enterprise zones been replaced, gasoline tax, NCIB, NGIB. And then the bottom one is the geothermal heat pump tax credit that was repealed and has been reinstated since then. Now, move on to contingent liabilities report. And you're going to get a much more detailed explanation, I believe, of this later. But the Department of Revenue's contingent liability report is where the state and the revenue estimating conference process keeps track of most tax credits for revenue estimating purposes. So see, the Department of Revenue's tracking of all these tax credits and their projections of the future of where they're going. We use that, it comes out 3 times a year, and we use that for every revenue estimating conference projection. I need to point out to you, though, that there is an error in this page. And it's not that digit right there in the top line, it should be a 4. It should be 4.244 in that top line. 4.244 billion. This page relates to this particular spreadsheet right here, and it does totally correct down at the bottom over the lower right-hand corner of 4.244. I apologize for that error. I have divided on this spreadsheet our tax credits, our existing tax credits within the contingent liability report into 2 main categories, which is business development tax credits and social tax credits. The division is strictly my own. You may find one of those listed under there more of a social credit if you want, but these are my credit divisions. And then within those business tax credits, I divide them into your basic business credits that any type of business can have. Your biofuel tax credits and renewable energy tax credits, which is the wind production and other geothermal tax credits. Over the years, I list on that sheet how much the Department of Revenue has calculated in 2019, each one of those credits, reduced general fund revenue, and how much from 2005 to 2019. So in 2000, as a group, as all tax credits are listed in the contingent liabilities report, $373 million of revenue reduction in 19, and from 2005 to 2019, 15 years, $4.244 billion of revenue involved with our list of tax credits. Now, there are some things that we track that are tax credit-like that are not on the contingent liabilities report, and I list them down here at the bottom. We have a biodiesel production payment that goes out as a sales tax refund, but it is just like any other contingent liability, and it is $4.3 million annually, not on that report. The ball field, racetrack, and tax payments, individual sales tax refunds that are sent out each year, less than $1 million annually. We divert $6 million of income. It's not an appropriation. It comes from the income tax stream. $6 million for workforce training. We have the taxpayer-dependent tax credit you see on your income tax return. That runs about $110 million annually. The old taxpayer trust fund tax credit was never on the contingent liability report. And then you get into these sales tax credits. Sales tax credits, exemptions, rebates, refunds, those kind of things. Like I said, there used to be 20 exemptions in the Iowa code for sales tax items. There's now, it goes to 106, but there's only 103 of them. There's been a lot of that kind of thing. That's not in the contingent liability report at all. It's not designed for those types of things at all. This is the history since 2005 of contingent liabilities. Here on the screen, I think you can see on your black and white printed, you can't really see that down at the bottom, right across the bottom is the red area. That's what I consider the social credits, and the blue areas are the business credits. Over that time frame, now that we're $373 million this year, from 2005 to 2019, the tax credits that are included within the contingent liabilities report have grown about $15.7 million a year. There is, have been over the years, kind of this thought that it's just eating the budget with big growth every year, but really, the contingent liability reporting does not, when you look at actual history, does not eat the budget. It does. It is $373 million. It has grown from 150 to 373, but it's really only about a $16 million a year growth, year to year. It did fall this last year compared to the year before. I have put together, LSA has a couple of things available that we track tax credits. We've built them to complement the work the Department of Revenue does. I've included the two documents on the back of this thing that I'll just reference. We have a tax credit series in our fiscal topic series that its job is to be a one-source document on each and every tax credit. It is a work in progress because it's a lot of work and it needs to be updated every fall. And so we are working feverishly each fall to complete this list. And I've just started to redo the new one, or the old ones that we have done, and to start the new one. But it combines the most recent contingent liabilities report, because when the contingent liability report comes out in October, that's the newest one, and it's got the next year of history on it, and we update the series of that. It takes information from the Department of Revenue's Tax Credit Users Manual, and then it also brings in any of the extensive reviews that the Department of Revenue does for the Tax Expenditure Review Committee for each of those tax credits. It brings those things together in a 1 or 2 page document to provide history of each of the tax credits and purpose and results if those tax credit reviews done by the department come up with results. And then finally, in discussing, and I know you're going to discuss today, how do we account for law changes that affect tax credits, whether you repeal one or whether you create one, and whether you amend one that exists. A lot of thought has to go into, well, yes, you're going to do that. You're going to raise this cap by $5 million, but when does the impact happen? It almost never happens right away. There is a delay. And we have also attached here into this is a 2-page document that kind of addresses a little bit how I go about how the Department of Revenue, in fact, Department of Revenue and Legislative Services goes about determining the fiscal impact, because in every section the fiscal impact of law changes is really big deal as far as the budget process. So how do we address how law changed today, and when does it affect the revenue stream? And that is my review of the history, discussion about provision liabilities. Started. In fact, if there are any questions, I'll answer.
Is there any questions? Representative Jacoby.
Thank you, Mr. Permanent Chair. Thank you for the history, especially in the 80s and the farm crisis. Can you tell me when it was, and this is in honor of a former representative, when we coupled residential and ag property taxes? Is that during the same period? Do you happen to know?
Slightly before. It would be 78, 79, something like that. The modern system we have now was put in place.
Okay, and last question. Do you have any mechanism between you and the Department of Revenue when we're looking at the contingent liabilities report that would show that the programs are successful and that they pay for themselves, even if it's by zip code or community, or is there any mechanism, even if it's anecdotal to a link, that to prove or show that those investments indeed pay for themselves?
No.
We don't. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Jeff. We will move on to tax credit mechanics, including refundability, transferability, and unclaimed credits. And Amy, help me with that middle name. Reader Harris, who is with the Department of Revenue.
Great.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on some income tax credit mechanics. So we've got some key terms that we use in the tax credit world that we're going to cover right now. So the outline of this presentation is we've got 31 tax credits that are claimed against income tax returns. Some individuals, some corporate, some both. And 5 of these credits, the program is expired, but claims continue to be made during the last 3 years because it just takes a while for these credits to work through, and you have carry forward and unclaimed credits and credits where you have contracts, and the taxpayer may take several years to get the work done. There's also 4 withholding tax credits claimed by businesses. As Jeff talked about, some of them are job training credits like 260E, and so those are slightly different because they're not claimed against the income tax return, they're claimed withholding returns. So the tax credit concepts we're going to talk about briefly are: is the credit awarded, automatic, or administrative? Is it refundable or non-refundable? Is it transferable? And then the other question about unclaimed credits and how does that work? So we have awarded, automatic, and administrative credits. That's how we break down these income tax credits. Awarded credits, we have 18 of them. They require the taxpayer to apply with an agency before doing any work or before taking any steps in order to get a tax credit certificate, and that's what, so the little example on there, it's kind of small, but they get a certificate, piece of paper from an agency, from the department. We issue some credits, and there's also leave the credits where the withholding, they don't actually get a certificate, that they get a contract, again, with a community college in order to make those claims. So, the reason some of them are awarded is because there's a cap on how the total amount of credit that can be claimed in any given, or actually awarded in any given year. And so that's why those credits require that process of entities coming in and saying, yes, I'm going to donate money to an STO. Okay, and they do that, they track, okay, we've gotten this much, and so then they can keep tracks of during the year. They don't exceed the cap that the legislature has put on that credit. Other times it's because they just, the entity that wants the credit has to go through some hoops. They have to say, I'm going to spend this much on the qualified rehabilitation, and I'm going to do it in this way. I'm going to put these kind of windows on, just different things that they have to do in order to meet the requirements of that agency that's administering the credit. So those would be awarded credits. They would have much more scrutiny, much more an ability to estimate how much is going to be claimed eventually, because you know that there's some limit on how much is being awarded every year. On the other hand, automatic credits are credits that can be claimed on the return by any eligible taxpayer. That there's a form that they have to fill out with the department that describes their eligibility and calculates the tax credit. But we don't know in advance of them filing that return that the award is going to, that credit is going to be requested. Because they just have to meet the requirements as laid out in the legislative creation of that credit. And finally, the third one is administrative credits. And they're very limited. They were created to avoid double taxation of the taxpayers. So for example, banks have to pay the franchise tax, regardless of whether they're a pass-through entity or a C Corp. And so those banks, if they're a pass-through entity, when they pass through their income to their shareholders, those shareholders also have to pay tax on that income. So now there's essentially a double taxation because the bank is paying a tax and the shareholder is paying tax. And so the franchise tax credit was created so that the shareholder could give credit equal to the amount of franchise tax that was paid on their behalf. And that way they're only paying tax once on that income. Okay, the next concept is refundability versus non-refundability. So just on a basic understanding of what refundability is versus non-refundability, non-refundability can only take your income tax liability to zero. And so if you have more than that, in some cases the credit just expires. In other cases they get to carry forward to the next year when they might have more liability and they can use it there. It depends on how the credit was created to have carried forward and how long that carried forward was for. Refundable credits, if they exceed the tax liability of that taxpayer, result in the department sending a check to the taxpayer. So the research activity credit, if the taxpayer has liability of $2 million, has a credit for $3 million, the department will send them $1 million check to cover the full benefit of that credit to them, so that they get the full incentive of what that credit was set up to do. So in fiscal year 19, $211 million in refundable income tax claims were reported. We had about $118 million in non-refundable income tax claims that were actually paid out to the taxpayers. Any questions on the concepts that we've gone over so far?
Senator.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Amy, does the 211, these are just business tax credits. This isn't like income tax credit, or this isn't like refunds that an average taxpayer get on there.
No, it would be.
So what are the sources of what are the major sources of the 211? What are the credits?
Well, you've got historic preservation, it's a big one, and the research activity credit, and then we've got a lot of biodiesel, blended fuel tax credits that were paid out that year as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay?
Continue.
Then the next concept is a transferable tax credit. Now, Iowa has the option, whatever the legislature makes this available, that taxpayers can sell a tax credit that they receive through an award to another taxpayer. They get their certificate, they have to surrender it to the Department of Revenue with information about who they're selling it to and how much they're selling it for. And the Revenue has 30 days to issue a replacement certificate to that transferee. The transferee, the one who bought the credit, can claim the full tax credit amount on their tax return, even if they only paid 90 cents on the dollar for it. Now, there's a few other parts of the law on this, that when you're selling the tax credit, it's a transfer, you can't, the amount that you receive from this sale isn't considered Iowa tax liability, or isn't considered Iowa tax. And likewise, the one purchasing the credit can't use that, whatever they pay for it, as a deduction as for Iowa tax purposes. So it's just all outside of kind of the tax system, because you have this credit, and if you want to sell it, you shouldn't get a benefit from it on top of getting the benefit from selling the credit. Likewise, if you're purchasing the credit and you're going to use it for 100% of the dollar, you shouldn't get a deduction for Iowa tax purposes. So it's try to be cleaner, and that we're not doing any double taxation or double benefits in this case. So we have 7 credits that are transferable, 6 that are in existence today, 1 that's expired, but there are still credits that are being awarded and transferred. So we've got the historic preservation, that is also a refundable credit. We see a lot of transfers there. The housing enterprise zone is the one where the credit is expired, but there's limited transferability on that credit when it was being administered, and so there's still credits that are allowed to be transferred. There's the Innovation Fund, which is an angel investor credit, and that one is transferable. There's a lot of outside of the state who are making those investments. Well, if they're not Iowa residents, they're unlikely to have much Iowa tax liability. So transferability allows them to sell to Iowa residents and get the benefit from the credit. There's the redevelopment or the brownfield grayfield credit. And then that one was originally just non-refundable and transferable. But at some point, the legislature decided to make, if it was a nonprofit entity that is doing this work, they could get refundable credit. So then there's less need for them to sell that credit and they get the full benefit of the credit. If it's a nonprofit, it's refundable and non-transferable. So they have that one option, which is to claim the credit once they get it awarded to them. The renewable energy and the wind energy credits, those are the production of electricity with renewable energy. Those are both transferable, and many of them get transferred on a regular basis. And finally, the workforce housing, which is replacing the housing enterprise zone, it is fully transferable. And we see a lot of those getting transferred as well. And on average, we've been tracking for the last probably 3 to 4 years how much they're selling these credits. And on average, they're sold for 90 to 95 cents on the dollar. So the purchaser of that credit's getting 100% of that credit claimed in their return, and the one who sold it is getting 90 cents on the dollar. So there are a lot, questions about whether that's a good deal for the state.
Is there a time frame on these certificates? Do they expire?
They do expire depending on what the carry forward is for the credit. So if it's a 5-year carry forward, and then somebody gets an award in 2019, then essentially they've got until 2025 to sell it or claim it. Okay, the last thing that I have got to talk, that was on the list to discuss of these, how credits work is unclaimed credits. Now, there's several different reasons why credits are unclaimed. One is they can expire before a taxpayer has that liability to use the full amount. So, I looked at over, STO has a 5-year carry forward. Over the last probably 4 years, where the credits have been around long enough to expire, less than 1% of those credits are expiring. So in those cases, most people are remembering to claim them and are able to use them. Now, some credits can go unclaimed because taxpayers just forget to file them. One example is the Endow Iowa claims. That's where taxpayers make an investment in an endowment fund in the state. And the problem with these is that it's got a $6 million cap. And taxpayers often are making donations and the cap's already been used. So then they get waitlisted until next year. So then you're sitting here in 2020 trying to remember that you made an investment in 2018. And so hopefully you'll remember that, but many of them forget. And so, like in 2014, 6.5% of Endow Iowa claims have yet to be claimed, and there's 14% of them are waitlisted. So we believe that a lot of those taxpayers got their certificate, set it aside, and then a year, 2 years later, they're still forgetting to claim it. And then another one that we see a lot of unclaimed credits is with the high quality jobs investment tax credit, because it has a long utilization period. The credit itself gets amortized over 5 years. So even though you may get an award in 2015, you're still claiming the first part of that award in 2020. And then there's 7-year carry forward. And so there's 12 years over which each of these awards can be claimed. And so about a quarter of high quality jobs, ITCs, are never claimed. And again, it can be because they forgot that they had them, or they just may never have enough tax liability to use those credits. So it's a question of, is there a better way to maybe get those credits, get the benefit of those credits to the business, if that's the goal, to try and incentivize them to do something by giving these credits. So that is my discussion of the mechanics as listed on the agenda. Is there any questions?
Anybody have any questions for me? If not, thank you for the presentation. And we will move on to accounting for tax credits with the state budget, contingent liability reports, revenue forecast. Angela Gillickson. Hope I didn't slaughter that too bad. Representative Jacoby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs. If we are streaming, could I encourage everyone to use their mics in the
Okay.
discussion? including the chair.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there a link to the stream somewhere? Is it possible to like share it with all our wonderful friends? Like,
The IT guy,
where can you find a link to it online?
The question is about the link to the live stream. Is that on our website?
On the website, on the right-hand side is the tax credit committee review, and then a little video of like a camera. If you click that, it'll open the live stream.
LSA's website?
On the General Assembly's
General
website, there'll be on the right-hand side, there's a marquee kind of listing the committee meetings. And
Thank you.
there's a little camera next to it.
There you go, Joe. Center both. We can adjust it a little bit.
While people are doing it, it might be nice for people to like share with their loved ones.
We did notice that no one used their mic during the discussion.
Angela, go ahead.
All right, good morning, thanks for having me. I'm going to discuss the contingent liabilities report. I'm going to start with a little bit of history. The first contingent liabilities report was published in April of 2007. At that time, there were 19 awarded credits. There were 33 credits that were forecasted. And at that time, we had only the contingent liabilities projection, and we did that for several years. The most recent contingent liabilities report was published in October of 2019. At that time, there were still 19 awarded credits. There were 6 that had expired since 2007, and then there were 6 new credits. And we forecasted 37 credits in total, which were 9 had expired, and there were 13 new credits. And the one thing that we've added over time is the expected claims projection. And I'll explain a little bit about what that is as we get going. So Table 8 in the contingent liabilities report is the contingent liabilities projection. So this is the maximum state tax credit liability each fiscal year, and that assumes that tax credits are fully awarded and they are fully claimed. Capped programs are tax credits with legislated limit of the amount of awards that can be issued in a year. And there are currently 20 capped tax credit programs forecasted. 5 of these tax credits will not have any additional awards allocated as they have expired. But the claims continue to come in due to carry forward and just the nature of the programs. But we still assume that 100% of the outstanding, if there's any outstanding awards, that 100% of those outstanding awards will be claimed. And then for the remaining 15 tax credits, it is assumed that the full amount of the award cap will be awarded each year, and it is assumed that 100% of those awards will be claimed before they expire. For uncapped programs, which are the automatic credits, they don't have a legislated cap, and so we do our best to forecast those, but there's more uncertainty. 2 of these tax credits have expired and are not expected to have any future claims. 1 has expired, however, claims continue to be forecasted for carry forward credits. And then for the remaining 17 tax credits, it is assumed that claims will continue to grow based on historical growth rates or as predicted by the Department of Revenue individual income tax micro model. So Table 9, which is the newer estimate, is expected claims. So what this does is it takes the contingent liabilities, which assumes 100% of awards and 100% of claims, and it says, well, what is actually happening and what do we think will actually be claimed? So if not 100% of awards are claimed, we reduce that amount. So we use historical awards to determine if a full cap is going to be issued or if only part of a cap is going to be issued. And then we use historical claim data to determine how much we think will be claimed in the future. So for the capped programs, once again, there's 5 tax credits that will not have any additional awards. We continue to forecast carried forward credits, but we use those historical claim rates. Instead of assuming 100% of outstanding awards will be claimed, we assume based on the historical claim data, which will likely be less. And then for the remaining 15, the expected amount of awards is based on historical award amounts, which may be less than 100%. And then once again, we use the historical claim rates to assume the percentage of awards that will be claimed before they expire. For uncapped programs, it's kind of the same thing. With the exception of 2 tax credit programs, the estimated expected claims are the same as the contingent liability. This just goes back to kind of the uncertainty. Because they're uncapped, it's harder to make assumptions about what is or isn't going to be claimed. And then the other 2 are reduced from contingent liability claims based on historical claim rates. So targeted jobs is a withholding tax credit. That one we generally don't see 100%, but it also doesn't have a cap. So that falls into that small capital programs. So this graph here shows you the difference between the figures for expected claims and the contingent liability estimates. So obviously up until fiscal year 19, they're the same because those are actual claim numbers. And then you see the growth. Contingent liabilities is higher because we assume 100% of awards, 100% of claims. Expected claims, is almost 100 million less. So, as Jeff mentioned, we provide this report prior to the REC members. In addition to the information provided in the report, we also provide the information broken down by tax type so that they can have that information as well. But it gets kind of bogged down to include that in this report as well. Questions?
Yes, is there any questions?
I do.
Representative
So,
Grassley.
for example, on the high-quality jobs, going back to this wasn't, nope, sorry, I got this one here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now look what I just did. We don't want that shot on the TV, don't turn away. All Senator Bolcom's constituents will shut it down if you see that face on there. So on the 24% of the high-quality jobs on the last presentation said they were unclaimed. So then moving forward, when you say historic, 2 pages ago here, you said something about using the historic average. Is that the number you're using, for example, for high-quality jobs?
Yes,
So that's,
we would only assume that 76% of awards.
so then the same with, so all of these on this list are what you're using for your contingent liability?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for the presentation. And if it's all right with everybody, we're just going to keep rolling. We're moving a little ahead of schedule, so we will move on to how are tax credits evaluated using criteria, audits, and assessments of oversubscribed or undersubscribed credits. Amy Roeder-Harris is back on the hot seat.
All right. Thank you again for an opportunity to talk to you about the work that we do. And we've got a lot of tax credits. We know that everybody wants to understand, are they working? Who is getting them? Who's, are the people that are they being fully utilized? Is it the program not of interest to taxpayers? And so we look at these kind of things to try to help inform legislators about the tax credits. You know, we originally started in 2007 as the tax credit program became established at the department. And then when the 5-year review schedule established in Iowa Code 2.48 started in 2011, that dictates what evaluations we actually complete now. So we've completed 37 income tax credit evaluations since 2007, and including one time through the 5-year review schedule established in Iowa Code 2.48. And we're working our way through the second time now. A total of 28 of the income tax credits have been studied. Not all of them, because not all of them are on the list in 2.48. And so, given the list is quite full, we don't have the time to also cover the ones that aren't on that list. And so if there are ones that, like workforce housing, that tax credit incentive program is not in 2.48. So at this point, the department's not scheduled to ever do an evaluation of that. So that's one thing to consider is if we want to be more broad, and what we look at is to make sure that that list is comprehensive. If it is comprehensive, it gets longer, which means we need more people to help us complete those evaluations. So it's not just as simple as saying, here, do one more, because one more takes one whole person to do, and so we have a limited staff as well. But along with those 28 income tax credits, there are a few other tax expenditures that are on that list that aren't tax credits per se. The property tax TIF, there's the property tax credits themselves, like the military, family farm, ag asset, or ag, the agricultural farmland, and the sales tax TIF are both are all on that list, and we have done some evaluations of those in order to be exhaustive with that list. We presented those to the Tax Expenditure Committee annually, usually in the fall or in December. So the department has received national positive feedback about the evaluations that we do. Future Trust is very interested in how states evaluate their tax credits and whether they do a good job of presenting to the legislatures of their states about the information that they would need to make some decisions about whether the credits are doing what expected. They've have complimented the department the state actually, for establishing for a full decade now a schedule for reviewing them. And we have a regular schedule for those reviews. And they have said that our evaluations provide a wealth of information in the tax credit program. And they also have complimented us on the establishment of advisory panels. So when we do an evaluation of a credit, we bring together an advisory panel to have the author complete a thorough and non-biased review. So we bring people like, if it's an award credit, like Economic Development Authority say they administer it, we bring the people who administer that program on the advisory panel. They can give us explain to us the steps that they take to get the right people on the list for the awards, to try to make sure that the credit's meeting its goal. We also bring along statewide stakeholders. So like in the case of this year, we're doing biofuel credits. So we've got the Renewable Fuel Association represented on there. I also have the petroleum marketers, which I know they have the name now, but we have someone from their group that's on the panel. So those stakeholders that can give their insight about how the credits might be perceived by the taxpayers, the individuals and the businesses that are claiming them. And then we also bring along some academics we have a group of very helpful professors from Iowa State University and the University of Iowa, and occasionally they get some from the University of Iowa that are agreed to sit on the panel and provide some insight as to whether the analysis that we're doing is economically rigorous and help us think about other ways we could maybe assess the value of the credit and how it's working. So the panels meet 3 times during the process to discuss research questions, review the analysis of this, how we're working as we go through, review the status of some of the economic results we're getting, and provide guidance for any improvements. And then the panel helps review the final study. And again, we can make that point out if there's anything in there that sounds biased, because the department is not in the process of doing evaluations because we want to make advice for, we don't want to make policy advice. We're there to just provide the information for you to make policy decisions about these credits. So our standard evaluation study includes description of the Iowa tax credit program, ideally including the goal of the program, which one was laid out at the time when the credit was created. It's got a thorough comparison to similar programs across the states and the federal government, if one exists, so that we can show how Iowa compares to those states. And then we do a data analysis on claims and awards, if it's applicable, if it's an awarded credit, to show how much has been issued or how much has been claimed since the beginning of the credit, and what's being used over time, and who's claiming those credits. And that's the statistics on our tax credit claimants is the next one, because we want to know, are the people that were claiming the credits, are they the kind of people that, are they the ones we expect? And lastly, we'll do an economic analysis of the impact of the tax credit whenever possible. And that's where we lean on our academics to say, is this a rigorous way to try to analyze, does the historic preservation have a positive impact on other properties and so on. The question on the agenda was asked about evaluation versus audits. And so I just want to emphasize that yes, audit decisions are made on some credits, but not by my team. So audit decisions within the Compliance Bureau, that's where those are made, and evaluations are completed by the Tax Research and Program Analysis Bureau. So we're focusing on the academic aspect, the economic aspect, while audits are made by those whose job it is to decide that taxpayers need to be reviewed, that something might need to be questioned about how they're claiming their credits. Now, so like in an audit, each claim is separately reviewed upon receipt to identify that the certificate number is there and it's accurate, and if the claim amount is incorrect, the taxpayer can be billed. So that's something that just happens automatically when the return comes in the door with a tax credit claim on it. But the systematic review of claims improves the accuracy of the information discussed in the evaluations data analysis section. So even though the tax research team isn't doing the audits, we still helpful to have that accurate information, so we're trying to we're able to provide as accurate information to you about usage and the value that state is getting if that's possible to do. We talked a little bit about this in my earlier presentation, is about oversubscribed, undersubscribed, underclaimed, overclaimed. So here's some discussion about, so we talked earlier about whether they're fully claimed, and maybe people forget about them, they set them aside, or they don't have enough liability. Well, this is on the side of actually the award piece. Initially, are they being oversubscribed, or are they being undersubscribed? So if there's a $2 million cap out there for the angel investor tax credit, is it being fully used? Well, in this case, yes. The angel investor credit is fully awarded every year, and there's waitlists. So they're getting people who are making investments right now who are not going to get credits until 2021 because there's so much demand for that credit. Now, why is that? Well, it recently was made a refundable credit, and so therefore, credits, investors from out of state are still able to benefit from it because they don't have to have Iowa tax liability in order to make the investment and get the award eventually. If they forget about it, then it'll be a little different, but they're, you know, is a substantial award wait list right now for that. The redevelopment tax credit at Economic Development Authority, they have a scoring process. So applicants in the July put in their application for why they believe they should get an award, and it gets fully awarded every year based on that scoring process. And it's also a transferable credit, or it's refundable if it's a nonprofit. Finally, another oversubscribed credit is the Endow Iowa tax credit. I talked about that earlier. If there's a $6 million cap, and it's usually about halfway through the year, they've fully awarded that cap. So then they have to put everyone else on a wait list for when that makes the cap gets used more quickly next year. So it's a non-refundable credit, but there's just a high demand for the benefits that taxpayers receive, which is a 25% credit on that. Those are some oversubscribed tax credits. Now, undersubscribed tax credits happen as well. There's several awarded credits that are facing really low demand. For example, the farm to food donation tax credit. In the 5 years that program's been in place, we've only had 47 taxpayers who made a claim on that credit. So it's a very low usage. And in fact, there's more people than that get set up so that they could get the award, but then because they have to fill out a form with the farm, with the food bank, then they have to fill out a form and send it to the department, and then those numbers have to match up. Well, a lot of the taxpayers aren't filing that second form with the department, and so getting no benefit from it. They don't receive the credit, which is a 15% credit. Now they can still, of course, if they don't get the credit, they can do and get the, take a donation on their return, but they can do both. So. Well, if you get the, Iowa, if you take the donation, then the maximum you get is about 8.53%. And so this credit is 15%. High quality jobs. We found that the economic activity in the state drives demands for state incentives. So there, the last 5 years, about 50 million out of the 105 million available to the awarded has only been awarded. So again, the high quality jobs not being fully used by those that actually get the awards, and then others are even taking advantage of trying to get an award. And it could be because the EDA is very strict, so I'm not trying to say that this is necessarily bad, This is maybe all that they find is of value is the $50 million of awards. But it is one where they might, if given an opportunity, be able to rethink how they can use some of that funds. Innovation Fund tax credit, it is non-refundable and transferable, and the supply of investment is too low. They have an $8 million cap, and they're going to be awarded about $1 million a year. So there's some discussion about potentially shifting funds between the one that's less utilized, Innovation Fund, to angel investor, which is more utilized. And will that bring that investment to the state and help us grow those businesses? Most likely, we're doing an evaluation on the angel investor credit right now, and so that we'll be able to give some opinion about whether that might be of good use. And finally, the renewable chemical production tax credit, which was created 2 years ago, the $10 million cap. So far, there's only been 2 successful applicants in the first 2 years, and the EDA is working with them to try to maximize this credit. But it's a case of it being undersubscribed as it's getting started. So what kind of economic analysis can you do? Different credits evaluations have explored different analyses. So like the redevelopment tax credit, where we're making investments in brownfield and greenfield, we did that evaluation last year. We looked at when investment was made in a brownfield, greenfield property, the property values of nearby properties increased. And so that was kind of a spillover, a benefit to more than just that taxpayer is benefiting that community potentially and broadly the state. So that's kind of some of the analysis that we did. When we did the school tuition organization tax credit 2 years ago, we compared the cost of the credits, so how much are people actually claiming these credits every year, versus lower public school funding costs. When we assume at least some of the people, some of the students that are getting these large scholarships, that they move to private school as a result. And so then the state is spending less on public education. And so we found that if we assumed around 30% of the children receiving scholarships, which is a reasonable amount considering some of the other states that have done similar analyses, that the state is actually better off financially financing the school tuition organization credit than just than doing nothing, because those students will then end up in public school. And so those are some of the economic analyses that we've done. Now, not all questions can be answered. Unfortunately, we don't have all the data that we'd like to have. So for example, we're doing the retail and biofuels tax credits right now for this year. And ideally, we'd love to say, because we have these credits, prices are lower in Iowa, and islands are buying more biofuels. Well, we don't have price data and sales data across states or around Iowa to compare. So we can't determine how much of the tax credit is being passed through to consumers, or if it's increasing demand. We just know what's being sold in Iowa. And that in and of itself is not enough to answer those questions. But we know that there's a lot of questions that people have, and unfortunately, the data just doesn't always exist to allow us to do it. Any questions about anything else?
Anybody got any questions? Yeah, thank you. I just jotted a couple of things down. You're talking about the ones that are not reviewed. Is there a list of those that aren't reviewed versus the ones that are being reviewed?
I don't have one with me, but we certainly can put
Okay.
them together.
That'd be interesting to see. Any other questions? I guess we'll move on to the last presenter. which deals with the impact of sunsetting tax credits on the state budget, and the process that may be used to sunset credits and the impact of the contractual liabilities. Mr. Michael Mertz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I fully realize we're coming close to lunch now, so I promise not to take up too much time. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the mechanics and technical aspects of the tax credit sunset or repeal under Iowa law, some of the policy considerations or questions that can arise when a tax credit program is repealed that should be kept in mind, and finally provide a little bit of fiscal analysis of what a tax credit repeal of tax credit programs might look like to the general fund of Iowa. So when we're talking about the contingent liabilities report, the vast majority of tax credits on that list are income tax credits. As you all know, income taxes are calculated and assessed on a tax year basis. That's usually a calendar year or some sort of fiscal year. So when a tax credit is being repealed, it's necessary to consider both the applicability to the tax year involved and to the incentive act event or expense that the tax credit might relate to. There's generally three methods for repealing a tax credit. Tax credit repeal could be retroactive. It could have some sort of immediate effective or applicability date, or the tax credit repeal could be prospective. When we're talking about a retroactive repeal, what we're generally talking about is repealing the credit retroactive to the beginning of the tax year that we're currently in, usually during the legislative session. But beyond that, immediate or prospective tax credit repeals can have a mix of tax credit effective date provisions or applicability provisions that relate to the award or expense paid. Some of these aspects seem rather technical in nature, so I think they do have some policy implications depending on how the tax credit is repealed, so I think it's helpful to maybe consider an example. So if we were to consider the example of a taxpayer, calendar year taxpayer, who incurred qualifying expenses for the assisted device tax credit, let's say that the expenses were incurred in January of 2020, and then the legislature desired to repeal that tax credit during the 2020 legislative session. So considering that example, if the legislature were to make the tax credit repeal retroactive to January 1st, 2020 for tax years beginning on after that date, in this example, the taxpayer would not qualify for their assisted device tax credit for the 2020 tax year because they incurred those expenses during the 2020 tax year, and the credit was repealed to the beginning of the tax year. If instead the tax credit repeal was made prospective to, let's say, tax years beginning on or after January 1st, 2021, in this case, obviously the taxpayer would qualify for the tax credit on their 2020 tax return because they incurred those expenses in a tax year prior to the tax year that the repeal was effective. If you were to add an applicability date provision there, it changes things depending on what the applicability date might say. So, for example, if the legislature intended to repeal the tax credit, again retroactive to 2020 for tax years beginning on or after a date, but they also made it applicable to expenses paid on or after the effective date of the act, that would considerably change things for this particular taxpayer, because if we assume that the provision were to take effect July 1st, like most legislative enactments, then in this case, the taxpayer would have incurred their expenses prior to the effective date of the act, and they would qualify for this credit on their 2020 tax return despite the repeal during the 2020 legislative session. Again, if there were another taxpayer that incurred expenses after July 1st, they would not qualify for the tax credit. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavor of some of the mechanics of repealing the tax credit. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. I just want to provide the committee with some information related to tax credit sunsets that are already provided in Iowa law. There are a whole host of them that have future repeal dates in the Iowa Code. As you can see from some of these dates, many of them tie to tax years. Some of these are tied to the date that the incentive act is completed or begun. So there's a mix of ways that you can repeal a tax credit, and the manner in which you repeal that tax credit can have a fiscal impact in the future as in the present. So there's a number of features that we've already talked about related to tax credits, and some of those features can have policy implications when a tax credit is repealed, specifically depending on the way that the tax credit is repealed. So I just want to point out some unique features of tax credits that, again, depending on the manner in which the tax credit is repealed, could raise some policy implications. The first of these is tax credits that are made on an award basis. We've already discussed what a tax credit award is today. There are a number of Iowa tax credit programs that are made on an award basis. You can see those highlighted ones on the left side of the screen. And typically, as we've already discussed today, these awards are memorialized in a contract between the state agency and some other taxpayer. These contracts often involve multi-year performances that are required before the issuance and the ability to claim a tax credit. So if the tax credit program that is issued on an award basis is appealed, it's just important to take into account what effect that repeal has on existing tax credit awards. To the extent that a tax credit repeal could be viewed as retroactively affecting existing contracts or awards, that does raise a number of questions that I don't have answers to, but they might become relevant in the future, such as does the contract between the taxpayer and the state agency address the possibility of a reduction in the availability of tax credits? Has there been reliance or partial performance by the taxpayer? Would this be an explicit breach under the terms of the contract? And does the contract contemplate remedies? Beyond programs that provide awards, there are several tax credit programs that are not made on an award basis, but they do involve public-private contracts between other political subdivisions and taxpayers that are participating in that program. For example, the Accelerated Career Education Tax Credit Withholding Program, the Iowa Industrial New Jobs Training Program under 260E. Both of these include long-term withholding agreements between the private business and the community colleges. These long-term withholding agreements supplement the costs of training programs that are offered by that community college. So if one of these programs were to be repealed, it raises the question of how that repeal applies to the existing agreements between these community colleges and the businesses. Similarly, the Targeted Jobs Withholding Tax Credit Program includes long-term contracts between private businesses and cities. These withholding agreements supplement the cost of the business's project in that city. So again, if a repeal of this program were to be viewed as affecting existing contracts, it just raises the question on what that repeal does to the existing contracts and the future performance or availability of the withholding credit under those contracts.
Just a minute. Over here in your list of tax credits, the little number, what's that? Is it significant?
The footnote?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Those are clear in the back? Is that what it is?
These lists were pulled directly from the contingent liabilities report.
Okay.
So the footnotes mean something on that report. They don't mean anything.
Okay.
Beyond public-private agreements, there's a number of tax credit programs in Iowa that don't explicitly involve a contract between a public agency and a taxpayer, but they do sometimes tangentially involve private agreements between two different taxpayers that affect the tax credit eligibility. The sunset of some of these tax credit programs has the potential to affect these private agreements or obligations. One such example is the beginning farmer tax credit. Under that program, eligibility is predicated on an agricultural lease agreement entered into between a beginning farmer and a lessor. These lease agreements may in some part depend on the availability of tax credits in the future, so it's unknowable, or it's at least questionable what happens to these agreements if the program were to be repealed in a way that affects existing agreements between these taxpayers. Similarly, the renewable energy and wind production tax credits, both of these programs, the eligibility and amount of the tax credit under those programs can depend on private power purchase agreements between the producer and purchaser of the energy. So again, if the program were to be repealed in a way that affects these existing agreements, it raises the question of what happens to the agreements between these private entities. The angel investor tax credit and the innovation fund tax credit are two economic development tax credits that offer incentives for investments in an economic development fund or early stage venture capital businesses. And the relationship between the private investors and these funds can often involve future investment commitments. Sometimes these are binding future investment commitments. It's uncertain whether these agreements between these private entities and taxpayers are contingent on the availability of tax credits for the investments in the future. So again, repealing a tax credit program in a way that affects existing contracts could have an impact on those private agreements. We've talked about transferable tax credits today. There are a number of tax credit programs in Iowa that offer transferable tax credits. As Amy pointed out, these credits are often sold or used as collateral in other transactions, often related to the tax credit program. So it's just unknowable if a tax credit program were to be repealed in a way that affects the transferee's ability to claim the tax credit. It's unknown what happens to the relationship between the person who sold it or pledged it and the transferee. Tax credit carry forwards, there are quite a few tax credit programs in Iowa that offer carry forwards. These carry forward periods range from 3 to 20 tax years. There's no average, but the most common carry forward period is probably about 7 years. Again, if the tax credit program were to be repealed in a way that affects a person's ability to claim unused credits in the future that they have already received in the past, it could affect that tax credit program. So it's just something to keep in mind if you're repealing the tax credit program. Finally, tax credit wait lists. as Amy just described, there are a number of tax credit programs that are oversubscribed, but do offer either in statute or in rule a wait list for those taxpayers who successfully applied but who weren't able to get a tax credit because the cap was reached in any given year. So the question is, if a tax credit program with a wait list were to be repealed in a way that were to extinguish that wait list or limit the availability of future tax credits to be issued to the people on the wait list, that can have an impact. I think one question is whether taxpayers on these wait lists have any sort of vested right to a future tax credit. To that end, I would just point out that most of the statutory language and rule language surrounding these wait lists do have language that says that placement on the wait list pursuant to this section shall not constitute a promise binding the state, the availability of a tax credit, and issuance of a tax credit certificate in a future year is contingent upon the availability of tax credits in that particular year. Finally, the remaining slides offer some fiscal estimates regarding what a tax credit repeal's impact might be to the general fund of the state. So in order to do this fiscal estimate, we made a couple of assumptions that are important to discuss before we look at the numbers. These assumptions assume that all tax credits on the contingent liabilities report were sunsetted at their earliest possible date without disturbing any prior awards, any prior claims, without disturbing any remaining transferability or carry forward amounts that a taxpayer may have, and the assumption, the fiscal estimate assumed that taxpayers on the wait list at the time the tax credit was repealed will be allowed to receive credits in future years based on the cap in existence at the time of the repeal. The slide on page 11, the numbers on that slide are the same as the expected claims projection from the contingent liabilities report. I think what's important on this slide to point out is the gray column, which has the assumed elimination date of the tax credit program. If you were to scan that, you'll see most of the credits are assumed to be repealed at the beginning of the 2020 tax year. Several of the credits that are made on an award basis pursuant to fiscal years are assumed to be repealed at the beginning of the next fiscal year. There are several tax credits on here that are already repealed, but they're on the contingent liabilities report, and they're still accruing cost to the state because of credits are still being claimed, so they're on this estimate as well. So if you compare the expected claims projection on this slide to the slide on page 12, that illustrates the fiscal savings that are projected to happen if all tax credits were repealed, and all the assumptions that I just discussed were made. As you can see, the total of all programs on the bottom, there isn't much change between fiscal year 2020 based on the actual projections and the assumed projection based on the repeal of the tax credits. The amounts do taper down over the next 5 fiscal years. But I'm going to go ahead and skip to the next slide because I think that provides a better illustration of the fiscal estimate, fiscal cost to the general fund. If you look at the bottom amounts on this page, this is the projected savings to the general fund from a repeal of tax credits over the next 5 fiscal years. As you can see, for fiscal year 2020, it's a projected savings of about $875,000. Fiscal year 2021 is roughly $153 million. And again, those savings to the general fund ratchet up over the next 3 fiscal years as those tax credit reward contracts are fully utilized and funded. Any questions?
Anybody have any questions, Mr. Mertz? Seeing none, thank you. I guess that wraps up the presentations. We're down to discussion. First of all, I'd like to thank all the presenters that gave us a mountain of information, of which I hope the committee members will take the time to maybe digest a little bit further in the future and maybe form more questions as to where we go and how we proceed. One of the questions that I wrote down here for the committee to kind of think about, I didn't realize that not all the tax credits were in this review, 5-year review process. I think we need to see that list and decide whether there's more that we want to review. And then, is that committee doing enough, and would we be better off maybe to have some more of a formal review through committees while we're in session to maybe give more of the legislators a little more view of what these tax credits are doing and how they're working. Like I say, that's kind of where I am at, and I guess I'll let Senator Chapman proceed, and then if anybody else has any comments.
Thank you. I would also thank those that presented today. Hopefully you found the time worthwhile. I think what strikes me most is how the tax credits from the 80s have ballooned in from a few to a growing populace of tax credits, and I think it's our responsibility as legislators to ensure that those tax credits are working appropriately, and we should be doing everything we can to review those and determine whether or not they should continue in perpetuity. What's also telling to me is the amount of work ahead of us if we're to make any changes, how those are long-term changes that we're not going to see an immediate impact because of the way these are structured. But that being said, I think there needs to continue to be conversation about tax credits here in the state, and look forward to having those conversations. So thank you.
Representative Hall.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would join you in saying thank you to our presenters. There's a lot of information to digest, and I think especially for the people who are maybe approaching this conversation for the first time. Representative Grassley and I worked on this issue a couple of years ago during session, and I know that there are a lot of hard decisions that have to be made, but I think one of the comments you said at the outset is a reasonable goal for the group, and that's to improve the predictability of these tax credits on our budget process. I would caution, I think, that if we're going to, we've established this interim committee, it's long past due in my mind, because this is a conversation that started 2 years ago but hasn't yet been approached. But if we're going to use this as a learning opportunity in this session today, I would be careful to dismiss the group following this learning opportunity and go into session when there are many more constraints on our time and the ability to weigh these decisions and make a recommendation as an interim committee to the legislature. I think that it might be more productive for the group to try and convene again or make some recommendations prior to January, because otherwise, 2 years in now, I'm wary of the fact that we would fall short on making recommendations once we get into the legislative session. There's a lot of information to parse through on this. I think for me, some of the clear things that were true 2 years ago and still remain true today are there are credits that are uncapped, there are credits that are automatic. That means that they grow regardless of whether we approve them or not. There are a lot of costs that go to taxpayers kind of unchecked, and I think establishing some uniformity in the programs, not only in how they're reviewed, but also making sure that Department of Revenue and EDA, when those credits go out the door, are communicating with each other to make sure that, you know, how they're evaluated is also uniform. There are a number of ideas that I know House Democrats put forth 2 years ago when this conversation was kickstarted. I'd be happy to present those to my colleagues on the majority side. I think that they would create some savings for taxpayers and also some fairness in our tax code without necessarily eliminating or gouging some of the good things that exist out there and are doing a lot of good. So certainly open to the conversation, but I do think, you know, dismissing this group and waiting for January to come around is not my favorite idea. I think that we should continue our work and come back now after learning to try and make some set of recommendations that help the overall group.
Senator Wolf.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. It's good to be here. Just a few kind of contextual comments. Just terrific presentations this morning. I especially want to highlight the work of the Department of Revenue, who for a very long time has had, now led by Amy, but has had a research division that has really been kind of our eyes and ears about how these credits actually work in real life. Frequently, people come to the General Assembly, have really good ideas. Most of them come out of the Economic Development Committee. Occasionally there's a pure tax issue, but many of the Economic Development Committee programs are tax programs, and over the years to see legislators work on those. But I think the Department of Revenue and their work on research is really important. They, I think, found out and alerted us about the film tax credit. They were involved in the dialing down of the fund program and other kind of disastrous financial program for the state. So they've done a really good job. It was noted that Pew over the last few years, Pew Trust has noted that I was doing a relatively decent job in trying to track these credits as a result of the creation of the Legislative Council's Tax Credit Review Committee, which I think is going to meet in a few weeks. It's the committee that reviews that rotating list of credits, and I agree we should make a new look at if there's new credits that need to be added to that list. If that is the place that we're going to do tax credit review, we should have all the credits on it that people think need to be reviewed. But Pew gave us a really good review because so few states back in 2007 were doing anything to review kind of what was going on this side of state spending. I guess we're here, we've had this conversation, I guess the governor's talked about it, legislative majority leader Republicans have talked about the need to do tax credit review, and we've waited really 3 years for today's meeting. And I share other members' views, Representative Hall brought it up, but what's next? When is this committee going to meet again? It was good for new members to get kind of this rudimentary understanding today of we have tax credits. Here's some are capped, some are not, some are transferable, some are refundable. Here's this kind of, we just kind of got a very rudimentary presentation this morning. Helpful, if you don't know much about it, helpful, but it's really about digging into the specific credits and understanding those. And we could have, for example, spent all morning just on 1 or 2 credits, kind of going over how does it work, who gets it, what does it cost, and then the evaluation part of it, which is actually quite subjective. I mean, some members think this credit works great, while other members think this credit is a waste of money, right? So it's a really difficult process. My constituents, and I think Iowans, have questions about the multi-million-dollar awards to companies like Facebook and Microsoft and Google, and I think everybody's waiting for what Amazon's going to receive through the high-quality jobs. My constituents and Iowans have questions about how we can be giving, kind of on automatic pilot, these enormous awards to these really, really rich companies. And does that make sense when we're not able to invest in broadband because we don't have enough money, but we have $20 million for a new data center? So that's one I'm interested in. And I think that people also wonder, my constituents wonder, how it makes sense to continue to write annually tens of millions of dollars of refund checks to some of the largest companies in the world that don't pay any state income taxes and receive these enormous refund checks. People wonder why that makes sense, or what, if it does make sense, let's have a discussion about that. And then I have constituents that see this dinky little solar tax credit that's been effective in creating jobs in virtually every county in the state. Because some of these other tax credits, they go to like Polk, you know, you think, where are the data centers located? They're not located in Sioux County, they're not located in Jackson County, they're located in Polk County. And the solar credit's been this investment in jobs and economic development. I use it as one example, where an investment that goes to economic development in all 99 counties, as opposed to credits that might be centralized in our more urban centers, as an example. We can talk about kind of where geographically credits get spent, but that's something I think that's interesting. So I have those questions from my constituents about the conversation today. But I guess I'd like to know from the chairs, and I appreciate Senator or Representative Hein, your thought about a process that would be baked into the legislative session, because I think if you look at the amount of work that our budgets appropriations subcommittee spend on reviewing, you know, the kind of the appropriation side, I think Ag and Natural Resources, I'll take as an example of a budget sub. I think their budget's somewhere around $45 million. And the committee has, the appropriation sub has the ability to meet for 6 weeks, a couple times a week, kind of pouring over $45 million worth of spending, right? We're looking at, I think, nearly $400 million here that maybe once a year we'll get together for a day like today and we'll review 5 or 6 credits. But not much more review of the other 25. So I actually think, have proposed this a number of years ago when we were in charge, and I couldn't get my leader's interest in it. But that we establish a standing appropriation subcommittee on this part of state spending, because it's averaging, you know, $350 to $450 million a year, that we actually have people that have legislative time when we're here. As we had a conversation about lunch earlier. You know, we get over here, people are busy. It's hard to dig in. I think like any of the spending and the appropriations committee, I mean, people come in, we grill them about what they're doing, and you know, you try and make sure we're getting our bang for the buck. I think this part of state spending would be well served by having a more structured time during the legislative session for review. So, Mr. Chair, I'd just be interested in the co-chair's view on what's next for this. If you're planning another meeting, and if so, what specific credits are you gonna should this group take a look at? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anybody have any other comments? Representative Jacoby.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I would ask the co-chairs, before we leave the building today, to schedule the next meeting before session starts. Because 2 things, I think Iowans really want to know where their taxes are going. And second, it gives people a chance, if we're going to have true review over the tax credits, it gives people a chance to put it on their calendar so that they can come and explain the positives and the negatives of those tax credits with us. So I appreciate your consideration.
Any comments?
I think it's important that we hear back from committee members, first of all, to determine whether or not, obviously we're going to have another committee meeting in regards to reviewing actual tax credits. That's going to occur. But I think it's important as chair of this committee to first and foremost hear from committee members after they have digested this information, where they would like to move towards and what they would like to see. As far as setting a specific date, I don't know that I'm comfortable doing that at this time. but I'm more than happy to entertain conversations from committee members on what they'd like to see. I hear you, Senator, that you'd like to see another meeting and talk specifically about specific tax credits, perhaps sending an email on what those tax credits are would be helpful. And I'll work with the co-chair on whether that's appropriate to have another committee meeting or wait till we have the credit review meeting to look at some of those. Yes, Senator.
Well, again, there's a lot of anticipation, I think, as you see the people around the room, there's a lot of important stakeholders here today that have a lot of interest in these credits, and I think the build-up to this over the last 3 years by Senator Feenstra, by Governor Reynolds, this is not a new topic. And the idea that we've been, and with all due respect, we've had a very rudimentary discussion today of like tax credits 101. Like, here they are, here's how some of them work. But I think people have a greater expectation that we're actually going to dig in and look at a few of these credits, some of the most generous credits, some of the most expensive credits for Iowa taxpayers, and actually have a discussion about those. So I guess I'm disappointed that the chairs believe this is, and I appreciate I can email you, and I don't have any expectation we're going to meet again to actually dig into the meat of this. So I'm disappointed that this is it. The big tax credit review is tax credit 101. Tax credit for, there's those books you buy at the bookstore with the yellow covers, tax credits for, or fixing your car for, right? I feel like that's where we're at here, and I'm looking for a little bit more substance, and I get the feeling that we're not going to really see it. And I'm on that, and we're going to have that tax credit review committee to look at those statutory 5 or 6 credits, great, but it leaves on automatic pilot some of the most generous giveaways, unnecessary giveaways, for another day. And I think Iowans expect us to do the work here, and if this is it, it's a huge disappointment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I wouldn't say that this is it. I mean, like I said, we've got a lot of information here. We're looking, I guess Senator Chapman and I are looking for input from you guys, the committee. Then we will go from there. I wholeheartedly agree with you that I think that maybe the next step is put into some sort of mechanics where we do a more formal review within the session, because I think we will involve more people and do a better job of looking over individual tax credits as opposed to coming in here 2 or 3 meetings during the year.
It's hard.
It's just, we all have other things that we need to be doing when we're out of session. Where we're in session, we dedicate our time to be here. And I guess that's kind of where I would like to see this head. I'm not opposed to having another meeting in December, but that becomes a very busy time of the year, and I guess I somewhat apologize to the committee for not getting this meeting set up sooner, so we did have more time. But I lean towards moving to some sort of a little better review within session, and I understand we're busy, but I think we can look at things and maybe come up with a formula that will meet that kind of criteria. So, any other comments? Other than that, I appreciate all the time that the presenters put in. I appreciate the committee members taking a time out of their busy schedule to come today. I hope you found it useful. And once again, I'd like to have the committee people give us suggestions, or anybody in the room that has suggestions on how to improve review or evaluating these tax credits. We are more than willing to have them, and with that, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Been moved. All those in favor of adjourn, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Committee meeting is adjourned.